This is University Lecture. Welcome to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today, Milton Rakoby, Urban Affairs Specialist and Professor of Political Science at the University of Illinois, Chicago campus, discusses politics and urban problems. Professor Rakoby.
I thought what I'd do tonight is take a look at what's going on in the urban areas of this country these days, politically, in the United States. Let me begin by saying that we are in the midst of, let me use an old academic cliche, we're in the midst of a very revolutionary period. What else is new? We're in a revolutionary period in terms of the urban areas, however, unparalleled in our history. As I'm sure you all know, this country began as an agricultural small-town society. And after the Civil War, between roughly 1860 or 1865 and about 1920 or 1930, this country was transformed from an agricultural society into an urban, a big city, industrial society. I think we are now in the midst of another transformation. We are changing from a big city industrial society to an urban metropolitan society. Now, there are two great things going on in this country in terms of our population, which is affecting the urban areas, particularly of the United States. Firstly, of course, we're in the midst of a population explosion in this country. We are now about, I guess, and the census figures won't be out for a while, but I would guess we probably have about 205 million people now in the United States. In 1940, we had 150 million people in the United States. In 25 years or so, this country went up from 150 million to about 200 million people, which is something like the population of countries like England or France or Italy. And by the year 2000, in about 30 years from now, we are going to jump from 200 million to about 315 million. Now, if you think we got troubles now in our urban areas, just wait a little while, especially if you're in college and you've got a long life in front of you. We're going to leave you plenty of problems to deal with in the urban areas as this population explosion takes place. It's getting so bad now, of course, in the urban areas, you can't get anywhere. You can't drive anywhere. The expressways are obsolete before they're built. If you step outside to breathe, you'll die of cancer from the air you breathe. I like what Jimmy Breslin says about breathing. He said he wouldn't breathe any air he couldn't see. And in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, you can see it, as you breathe it. Not only is the air getting all fouled up and you can't get anywhere on the expressways and you can't get anywhere, public transportation is obsolete before it's built, that kind of thing. But everything's crowded. In the urban areas, in cities like Chicago and New York, if you want to go to a restaurant, you got to stand in line. If you want to see the opera, you got to buy tickets a year in advance. If you want to see the Chicago Bears play football in Chicago, you have to wait until somebody dies and they leave their tickets in their will to their children. That's the only way you get a ticket to see a Bear game. If you go on vacation somewhere, you got to make a reservation a year in advance. I spent a couple of summers in California teaching in L.A. That cured me for all time of going there. I thought maybe we'd go up to Yosemite. Everybody says Yosemite's a beautiful place that you ought to see. Well, to get a reservation in Yosemite, you got to make it a year in advance. How do you know you want to go there a year from now? So forth. You can't go any place now without. Now, it's going to get a lot worse, because if we're going to jump another 110 or 115 million people in 30 years, think of the kinds of problems that we're going to have just in terms of that. Now, another significant thing about that population, too, is that, of course, that the great growth in that population is on two ends of the age spectrum. It's young people, a lot more babies being born, and it's on the other end of the age spectrum, people over 65. Everybody's living a lot longer than they used to. The doctors are making all sorts of advances in medicine, which people are now living now 75, 80, 85. And of course, these are the two groups in the population which need the most help. They are the groups which are least able to take care of themselves. You need schools, housing, economic opportunities for the kids. You need recreational facilities, medical facilities, housing, so forth, for older people. And of course, the burden of taking care of the two groups in the age spectrum that need the help is going to fall on those in their middle years. Middle years, roughly, let's say, from 22 up to 65, which is a long spread. They got to pay the taxes. They got to take care of things. And of course, it's going to inevitably mean, too, that government is going to have to do a lot more than it ever did before, because the kinds of things that these people need and the kinds of services which are going to be required can really only be best performed by government. No, that's one of the great significant factors. Again, you see, most of these people, not only is that population growing rapidly, but most of these people are going to live in the urban areas of the country. Somebody estimated that by 1980 or so, about 10 years from now, that about 52% of the population of the United States will be living in three great metropolitan regions, which are developing rapidly now. And the other half of the people will live in all the rest of the country, but half of us will live in three metropolitan areas of the country. There's one on the East Coast developing now from Boston, which is going to run all the way down to Miami. You'll drive straight down without ever leaving a town. You can drive from Boston down about Richmond, Virginia without ever leaving a town. There's another one out on the Pacific Coast, of course, which will run from the Mexican border up to way up north of San Francisco, which is developing rapidly too. And there's a third one in the Middle West, which is developing roughly from Detroit through Gary to Chicago, out to Cleveland, and up to the Milwaukee-Kenosha complex, a great big metropolitan region developing there. Now, we're moving like we never moved before in this country, too. There are three great population movements taking place in the United States today. One is a movement of people from small towns to metropolitan areas. A second is a movement of people from the south, of course, to the big cities of the north. And the third is a movement of people from the big cities to the suburban areas. There are three great things going on roughly at the same time. Now, what is this doing to this country politically? My field happens to be political science, and I'm not much interested in sociology or the cultural changes, but in reading the political implications of these shifting populations. What's happening in these areas as a result of these movements politically? Well, firstly, the movement of people from small towns up to the metropolitan areas isn't making a great deal of political difference in this country. Most people who live in small towns, in towns like Ames or Iowa City or Des Moines, they're generally Republicans. For some reason I don't understand, but they're generally Republicans, and they're generally pretty conservative. And most people who live in cities like Chicago and New York and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, they're generally Democrats and generally somewhat more liberal. That's the basic pattern in the country. What happens to people when they move from small towns in states like Illinois, let's say New York, up to the metropolitan area? Well, nothing happens to them politically, actually. What they actually do, most people who leave small towns don't move into cities like Chicago. If they come up to the Chicago metropolitan area, they move to Arlington Heights, Mount Prospect, Naperville, Western Springs, someplace like that. They never move into cities like Chicago. Chicago's full of black people, Catholics, crime, delinquency, and dailies there. So they don't move into Chicago. They move into Mount Prospect, Arlington Heights, those kinds of places. And all this really adds to is a kind of a transfer of Republican voters from one small town to another small town out on the fringe of the big city. And most of those people have nothing to do with the big city. They never come into Chicago. Or if they do, they get out as fast as they can. Or if they work there, they never go back at night. They never come down on weekends. So actually, all they've done is they haven't changed their lifestyle at all, really, and they haven't changed their politics at all. It's a kind of transfer of Republican strength. There's a second great movement taking place in the United States. Of course, it's the movement of people from the South into the big cities of the North. Heavily black, of course, but not just black. A lot of Southern whites are beginning to move into the big cities too, primarily for economic reasons. Now, this is having a significant impact on the politics of the big cities in this country, the big northern cities particularly. Big northern cities in the United States have always been dominated culturally and politically by one overriding factor, the factor of nationality. The growth of our big cities was tied closely into the great immigration from Europe to this country, which took place in the last half of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century. That immigration changed the character of America to a considerable extent, and it completely changed the character of the big cities. When I said at the beginning that we changed from an agricultural small-town society to a big city industrial society, that change took place with this great immigration from Europe to the United States. Now, this country was settled originally by certain kind of people. It was settled by people from Northern and Western Europe, the Dutch, the Scotch, the English. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants from Northern and Western Europe came here first. They got chased out of Europe, of course, in the early days. If you can trace your ancestry back to the Mayflower, or if you belong to the Daughters of the American Revolution, you can certainly trace your ancestry back to somebody who was picked out of a jail in England and sent over here as a punishment. And if you survived, then you survived, and you can, part of that. Those people built this country, and it was their country until roughly about 1850. About 1850, the United States began its Industrial Revolution. And of course, that began the development of the big cities in the country. When we began our Industrial Revolution, we needed people to man the factories which were being built in the big cities. And we went to Europe to get them. And we went to two areas of Europe primarily to get people to come here. We went to Southern Europe and to Eastern Europe. And between roughly 1870 and 1910, there was a tremendous migration of people from Southern and Eastern Europe into the big cities of this country. For example, you take a city, and the cities exploded. You take a city like Chicago. In 1871, at the time of the Great Fire in Chicago, Chicago had a population of 100,000 people. By 1890, it jumped to 1 million. By 1920, it jumped to 3 million. Between, in 50 years, the population of that city went up from 100,000 to over 3 million people. Those were all people from Eastern and Southern Europe who came to Chicago and who came to all these cities like Detroit and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and cities of that kind. They came into these big cities from these areas. Now, two things happened to our politics as a consequence of this great migration from Southern and Eastern Europe into the United States. Firstly, the country became split politically between native white Anglo-Saxon Protestant control of the rural areas, small towns in the country, and of the state and national governments. And on the other side of the fence, you've got nationality, ethnic control of the big cities. The big cities became dominated by these nationality ethnic groups who were heavily Catholic, with the minority of Jews thrown in. They took over the big cities. So you had a country which was split politically between these nationality groups running the cities and taking them over, and the old stock running the country and the state governments all over the United States, and we still have something of that kind of thing going on. If, in a sense, John F. Kennedy was a breakthrough nationally for the newcomers to this country, not just for the Irish and the Catholics, but for the Irish, the Catholics, the Poles, Italians, Bohemians, Jews, and blacks, so forth. When Kennedy came into office in 1961, he appointed to his cabinet John Gronewski as Postmaster General, a Pole, Arthur Goldberg, a Jew, as Secretary of Labor, and Celebrezze as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. That's the first time in the history of the United States that we had three guys named Goldberg, Celebrezze, and Gronewski in an American cabinet at the same time. Nixon's victory in 1968 is a victory for the others. Uh, if you looked at Nixon's cabinet when he introduced them on television that night, it was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant cabinet. No blacks, no Jews, I think one Catholic, a couple of Irishmen like Moynihan on the side in the thing. So that's what happened to the country politically as a result of this great migration. One of the factors. A second thing that happened politically, which was of great significance in the urban areas, was that nationality came to dominate both the cultural life and the politics of the big cities. These nationality groups, when they came to this country and they moved into the big cities, they never became citizens of those cities. Actually, what they did is to move into a neighborhood in a city and create a piece of the old country in that neighborhood. And I'm much more familiar with Chicago than I am with other cities, but I know New York fairly well, Los Angeles fairly well, and some of the other, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit, some. But if you take a city like Chicago, Chicago is not a city in a European sense. Everybody who lives in London is English. Everybody who lives in Paris is French. No, most people. Everybody who lives in London, in Rome is Italian. That's not true in Chicago. Chicago, we have 600,000 Poles. We got more Poles in Chicago than any city in Poland except Warsaw. Warsaw has more Poles than we have. We have more Bohemians in Chicago than any city in Czechoslovakia except Prague. We got more Lithuanians in Chicago than any city in Lithuania except the capital. You can take almost any of these ethnic groups. What these ethnic groups did is move into cities like Chicago and create for themselves ethnic ghettos in which they lived and which they never left. So you had an Irish neighborhood, strictly drawn lines. Across the street from that was an Italian neighborhood with strictly drawn lines. Past that was a Polish neighborhood. In Chicago, the Poles needed two neighborhoods because there were so many Poles. They had a southwest side and a northwest side for the Poles. And you had a Bohemian neighborhood and a Lithuanian neighborhood. These people lived in these neighborhoods. They never left them. They picked up a piece of the old country. Consequently, people in cities like Chicago and big cities don't identify with their cities as citizens of the city. They identify themselves as people from a neighborhood. And our big cities are fragmented ethnically, nationally, along these lines, and still are to this very day. The melting pot in American cities has not melted very well between these ethnic groups. Now, when these nationality groups came here, the dominant group in the big cities were the Irish. The Irish had several advantages over everybody. They got here first. They were the first ethnic group in who were non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So they got here first. Secondly, they had another advantage. They spoke English. They're the only ethnic group that came in that spoke English. Poles, Italians, Lithuanians, Bohemians, Jews, Hungarians, Russians, none of them spoke the language. But the Irish did when they got here. Thirdly, when the Irish got here, they were familiar with American political institutions when they got here. They understood the whole political system because they lived under English institutions in Ireland. And they're the only ethnic group which had that kind of experience too. And fourthly, they had another great advantage. The first thing the Irish did when they got here to the big cities was to open up the taverns, to remind themselves of what things were like in the old sod back in Ireland. I spent 3 days in Dublin a couple of years ago, and all you do in Dublin is sit around the pub all day long. I don't know when the Irish work, or if they ever work. They spend most of it, they can't get out of the pubs to go to work, practically. Well, when the Irish got here, the first thing they did was open up these pubs, taverns, and now those taverns became the centers of political activity in the big cities in the north. The taverns became the centers of both social and political activity because as the other ethnic groups came in, as the Poles, Lithuanians, Bohemians, Germans, so forth came into the big cities, they moved into these neighborhoods and the Irish tavern owners and bartenders were there waiting for them and took them over. If you were a Lithuanian, you moved into back of the yards in Chicago, like where Daley lives, in Bridgeport. If you were Lithuanian, you moved in there, you didn't speak the language, you didn't know anything, you went down to the local tavern, the bartender or the tavern owner gave you a note to go see Tim Sullivan over at United States Steel, and you went to work. He got you a job. And you could eat off the bar all night long by buying a couple of beers, and when you were broke, they loaned you a couple of dollars. The taverns were the centers of social activity, and then became the centers of political activity. And the tavern owners became the bosses, the political bosses of the big cities in this country. For example, the two most famous characters in Chicago's political history are Bathhouse John Cogwin and Hinky Dink Kenna, two tavern owners who ran saloons in the Loop, or near the Loop, and they were two of the big-time bosses in Chicago. We still got a few of those tavern owners in the city. Now, the nationality then came to dominate big city politics. And this is still true to this very day in the big cities of this country. For example, in Chicago, when a political ticket is made up by the Democratic organization, what some people call the machine, what some of us call the organization, and when the organization makes up a ticket, each ethnic group is allocated a piece of the ticket. The mayor's got to be Irish. That's an Irish job in Chicago. Daley's been in there 4 terms, with a 5th coming up. Before him, Kennelly was in there for 2 terms. Before him, Ed Kelly was in for 3 terms. We elected one Bohemian back in 1931, Tony Cermak, and they shot him, and Ed Kelly took the job. An Irishman took the job over. The mayor's job is an Irish job in Chicago. The city clerk's job is a Polish job. The city treasurer's job is a Jewish job. The clerk of the circuit court is a Lithuanian job. The clerk of the probate court is a Bohemian job. Postmaster, Chicago Post Office, German job. When they run judges for the bench, for the municipal bench, they always run 4 or 5 Irishmen, 3 or 4 Poles, 3 or 4 Jews, a couple of Lithuanians, 1 Scandinavian, 2 Germans, a couple of Bohemians, so forth. Until finally, about 10 years ago, when the black population in Chicago got up close to 1 million, finally the blacks got a judge. Judge Wendell Green went on the bench, and now there are probably about 10 black judges in Chicago. I would guess in time some Puerto Rican will get to be a judge in Chicago as soon as we get enough Puerto Ricans in Chicago. There's only 45,000 Puerto Ricans. That's not enough to get a judge in Chicago. And some Puerto Ricans got to get out of law school. You have to have a law degree before you can be a judge in Chicago. That ethnic factor is still true in all the big cities in the country. For example, if you lived in New York, you had to be Irish, Jewish, or Italian. Those were the big ethnic groups in New York City. When Fiorello LaGuardia was mayor, he had 2 groups sewed up because he had a Jewish mother and Italian father, and he had 2 groups locked up. In fact, in the United Nations General Assembly, there's the nations of the world sit alphabetically, the big semicircle in the General Assembly, and Ireland, Israel, and Italy sit next to each other, and they call that the New York bloc in the General Assembly. If you lived in Milwaukee, you had to be Polish or German. If you were Irish in Milwaukee, you're dead politically. And if you lived in Pittsburgh, you had to be, or Detroit, East European for those areas. Now, the interesting thing about those ethnic groups, too, was that ethnic identification has maintained itself into the 2nd and 3rd generations. When those groups move, as the city changes, they move as groups. Now, what happened to Chicago and to every big city, of course, beginning around 1940, was the great black migration from the South into the big cities of the North, which began to change the character of the big northern cities. Now, what happened as a result of that was that race replaced nationality as the dominant factor in big city politics in the North. When the blacks came up, they followed the same patterns that the old ethnic groups had followed before them. New immigrants never go to new neighborhoods in big cities. New immigrants always go to old neighborhoods. And what happens in those old neighborhoods is the old settlers in those neighborhoods at first resist, then retreat. And the blacks take over, and the old ethnic group picks up and creates a new neighborhood somewhere else. That's what happened in Chicago. As the blacks came into Chicago and began to spread south in the city, through the south side of the city, the Irish picked up. The Irish lived on the south side. The way the ethnic groups came in, the Irish lived on the south side, near south side, the Germans on the near north side. The Chicago River was a dividing line. The Jews lived just west of the Loop. Just north of the Jews were the Italians in their neighborhood. South and west of the Jews were the Bohemians, and farther west of the Bohemians were the Poles. And then on the northwest side were the Poles. The Lithuanians settled on the southwest side. As the blacks came in, they came into the near south side, because that's where the trains from the south stopped, at the IC station at Roosevelt Road, Michigan. And the blacks began to settle in there. The Irish began to retreat. Then the blacks began to push west. The Jews picked up and went out, flung themselves across 3 or 4 neighborhoods of Poles and Bohemians and created a new neighborhood. As the blacks pushed west into the Italian neighborhood, the Italians picked up and went farther west from there. And now, as the black population in the city has increased tremendously, these ethnic groups are all beginning to leave the city and go to the suburbs. This is having a tremendous impact now on the suburban communities of this country. Now, in the city, the basic pattern in this country, in the big cities, has always been a heavy Democratic vote, of course. The suburbs and small towns of the country are Republican, the big cities are heavily Democratic. For example, if you take a state like Illinois, the rule of thumb in Illinois is that a Democratic candidate has got to come out of the city of Chicago with a 350,000 vote majority. If he doesn't do that, he's going to lose the state. If he comes out of Chicago with a 350,000 vote majority, he'll lose the suburbs by 150,000. He's still 200,000 ahead when he goes out of Cook County. When he gets downstate, he'll lose downstate by around 200,000. So it's close. If he comes out of Chicago with 400,000, he wins for sure. That kind of thing. That's a basic pattern in the country. The great strength of the Democratic Party has been in the big cities of this country. Now, that strength still holds firm, but on a new basis. As the blacks came into the big cities, they became Democrats. The blacks who came into the big cities from the South never voted. When they come into the big cities of the North, especially into a machine-run city like Chicago, the Democratic precinct captains meet them, the train, register them, get them voted, and bring them into the Democratic organization. And the significant thing that's begun to happen in the city of Chicago is that the great strength of the Democratic Party in cities like Chicago, New York, and Pittsburgh are now, and Philadelphia, are now in the black areas of the city. The ethnic groups have left, the blacks have moved in, but have become Democrats. So the Democratic Party is still holding the big cities of this country and will hold the big cities of this country for a long, long time into the future, but on the basis of the black vote in the big cities. I'll give you a couple of statistics. There are 2 wards in Chicago, which are 100% black practically, about 98% black, the 24th and 29th wards. In the 24th ward in 1968, Humphrey got 21,000 something votes and Nixon got 500. In the 29th ward, Humphrey got 24,000 and Nixon got about 300. And that's a typical pattern in those wards. So the Democratic Party is holding the cities, but again on a new basis. Now, the ethnic groups from the city are beginning to move to the suburbs and have moved to the suburbs in great numbers over the last 20 years, or 20 or 25 years. I don't know if you know it or not, but every big city in the United States is losing population. There's no single, with the exception of a couple of places like San Diego, Long Beach, Fort Worth. There are a few cities which have gained population, but every major city in the United States is losing population. With the migration of blacks into the city, you're getting a migration of ethnic whites out of the city. For example, in Chicago, the population went up from, the black population in Chicago in 1940 was 250,000. In 1950, it was 400,000. 1960, it was 800,000. In 1965, it was about 1 million. And the best guesses are that for the census this year, the black population in Chicago will probably be about 1,300,000. Between 1940 and 1970, the black population in Chicago will have gone up from 250,000 to about 1,300,000. At the same time, the city lost 2% of its population. It went down 2% in the same period, which meant that if 1 million blacks moved into the city, a little over 1 million whites left the city and went out to the suburbs. Now, a lot of people think that this great migration of whites from the cities to the suburbs of this country is going to change the pattern of American politics in the sense that it's going to create a majority Republican Party. Because there's an old theory in political science called conversion theory. The theory is that when a Democrat from the city moves to the suburbs, he becomes a Republican. And I've heard this theory propounded by everybody, from people from Mayor Daley to Senator Paul Douglas to all kinds of political scientists. Theory is, you leave the city, you become a Republican in the suburbs. It's not happening. As the Democrats leave the city and move to the suburbs, they are not becoming Republicans. And actually, what's beginning to happen in the suburban areas of the country is that Democratic strength is beginning to grow now in the suburban areas of the country, while the Democratic Party is maintaining its strength in the big cities on the basis of the black vote, which is moving into the big cities. Now, the theory is that you move to the suburbs, you become a Republican because you make a little more money, you buy a house, you start paying taxes, you get a little more conservative, so forth. Doesn't happen. Now, why not? Well, there's no such thing as a suburb. There are all kinds of suburbs. I would generally divide most suburbs into two major kinds of categories. You have, firstly, what I would call development suburbs. You had a farmer's field, some builder came out there,
put up 2,000 houses, and all of a sudden you got 15,000 people living in a place that used to once be a farmer's field. Who's moved there? These are generally working class and lower middle class Democrats, heavily Catholic, heavily East European, who've left the city and moved to these development suburbs. And they're not becoming Republicans in those development suburbs, with a couple of exceptions. And one reason for that is, when they move to these kinds of suburbs, these development suburbs, all they find there are other people like themselves. It's a group of Democrats who moved together and have created practically a new ghetto, a new ethnic area, someplace farther out from the city. Now, the other kind of suburb are the old established suburbs, the old towns which are close in to the big city, and which are generally middle class and upper middle class. And in these areas, they're attracting, these old communities are attracting upper middle class Democrats from the city who are moving to these areas. Now, they normally ought to be the ones who ought to become Republicans in the suburbs, because they're upper middle class, their income's gone up, their education level's fairly high, so forth. Very few of these people, almost none of them, are switching to the Republican Party in the suburbs either. Now, how come? Well, there's a couple reasons for it. Firstly, it's very hard to switch. Lenin once said, "Give me the children for 10 years, you'll never undo my work." And the church knows that too. Give me the children. It's hard to change them after a while. If you've been born in a Democratic family and grown up in a Democratic family, chances are 100 to 1 you're going to be a Democrat all your life. If you're growing up in a Republican family, chances are 100 to 1 you're going to be a Republican all your life. Most of the Democrats who move to the suburbs have been born and have grown up as Democrats and don't switch to the Republican Party. But there's another major reason why they don't switch. Even if they wanted to, it's pretty hard for them to do it. Because in most of the old establishment suburban communities in this country, which again are heavily white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, when these ethnic groups move into these communities, they're generally quite isolated there. They've discovered that, nobody talks to them. You can move into one of these old communities and live there 10 years and you never meet anybody, except some other ethnic Democrat like yourself who moved out there, who talks to you, but the old settlers don't talk to you. They don't even talk to each other, let alone talk to you. Nobody talks to anybody in most of these communities. They're quiet communities where you could fire a cannon down the street all day long. You never hit anybody because nobody's ever outside. Nobody mixes. Nobody talks to anybody. We've lived in Chicago all our lives. We moved to Evanston 10 years ago for schools. And when we first bought a house in Evanston, Evanston's the first, one of these old establishment suburbs just north of Chicago. When we first got there, we rented an apartment for 2 years, and we're a very gregarious family. When we left after 2 years, nobody came out to say goodbye because we didn't know anybody. Nobody had spoken to us. So
8 years ago, we bought a house. And we're in an area of Evanston which is kind of mixed. I would say it's about 75% Gentile, about 25% Jewish, and we've been there 8 years. And, we know after 8 years, we know the Friedmans next door, and the Luboffs across the street, and the Shapiros on Dobson, and the Rubensteins on Brummel. That's how we know after 8 years. We don't know anybody else in that area. Nobody talks to anybody in these areas. Consequently, when you move to these areas, you're driven in on other people like yourself, and that's all you meet. Now, political attitudes don't just happen. They develop out of social and cultural contacts and factors. This kind of thing is not taking place in these suburban areas of the country. Now, if this trend continues into the future, what are the prospects for both political parties? Well, the prospects, if the trend continues into the future, and if the pattern stays the same, the prospects for the Democratic Party are pretty good nationally, because the party's going to hold the big cities with the black vote and increase their vote in the suburban areas heavily as a result of the movement of these ethnic Democrats out to the suburban areas. And the statistics tend to bear this out, with some exceptions. What's beginning to happen to these Democrats in the suburbs now is that they remain Democrats nationally, but they don't remain Democrats locally. They become kind of schizophrenic political animals. They still retain their traditional identification with the Democratic Party and its candidates, but at the local level, they're not much interested in ideology and politics. They're interested in administrative matters, in getting their taxes, keeping their taxes low, in getting good schools, in getting public transportation, keeping the streets clean, those kind of recreational facilities. And they don't care whether you're a Democrat or Republican. So what we're developing in our suburban communities now in this country is a kind of split-level politics in which people are retain an identification with one of the national parties at the national level, but in which they're becoming generally nonpartisan at the local level. And if you look at the statistics on people's identification with the two parties, it's very interesting. The Democratic Party, traditionally about, I'd say, roughly 45% of the people in this country identify themselves as Democrats. And maybe 27% identify themselves as Republicans. And the rest identify themselves as independents, whatever that means, in this country. Year by year, for the last few years, the number of people identifying themselves as Democrats is beginning to go down like a percentage point a year. It gets down to 42, 41. But the number of people who identify themselves as Republicans doesn't go up at all. In other words, these people are becoming independents of a sort, but they are not becoming Republicans in this country. Now, I think what that means for the future is that the ball game is really wide open politically for both political parties, because the great growth of population in this country is going to be in the future, of course, in the suburbs, not in the cities. The cities will never gain population anymore. And one of the reasons that they won't is that once people move to the suburbs, they never come back to the city. Now, a lot of city people don't understand this. Daley doesn't understand it, for example. Daley thinks he's rebuilding Chicago to bring people back from the suburbs into the city. He's out of his mind about that kind of thing. People who've left the city never and go to the suburbs, most of them will never come back for a couple of reasons. One, if you want to come back, the neighborhood you left is gone. There's practically no place to live left in most areas of big city areas in this country. Number two, when you've been out in the suburbs for 20 years, the theory again is you move out to the suburbs for schools and for the kids. Get a house and get the grass and so forth. And you get tired of the crabgrass and cutting the lawn, and you can't wait for the kids to grow up, go off to college. As soon as they do, you sell the house and move back to the city. Trouble is, when you've been out in the suburbs for 20 years, until the kids have grown up, You've built up all kinds of associations, a different way of life. Your wife doesn't want to go back to an apartment. You might want to get rid of that lawn and that snow shoveling and so forth, but she doesn't want to. She's got her friends, and there's no neighborhood for you to go back to unless you move to one of the new high-rise buildings, which they're building in the cities. And if you can afford to pay $400 or $500 a month rent for a small two-bedroom apartment, you can move into one of those places. So our cities are really becoming places, and Manhattan's a classic example of this. Chicago's getting like it. The only people who live in cities now, these days, are the rich or the poor. Middle-class people generally can't live in most of the cities anymore in this country and will not come back to the cities. They will remain in the suburbs. And in fact, if anything, if you watch the population trends these days, people are not, instead of coming back, they are going farther out from the cities. What they're generally doing is selling the big house, buying a smaller house, or now they're building condominiums, townhouse developments, and apartment buildings in most of the suburbs, and they go farther out from the city instead of coming back to the city. And I think it's probably a fact of life in this country that most of our cities in the foreseeable future, in the not too distant future, are going to be heavily black. We're going to have black cities generally surrounded by heavily white suburbs in the foreseeable future. Now, that's going to mean, I think, of course, a kind of still bifurcated population divided on the basis of race. Now, there's a couple of things which may change this some, and I'm going to wind up in a few minutes. I'm running a little too long, I think, already. One of the great significant factors which may affect this some is what's happening to the college kids. About 50 years ago, 3 or 4% of the 18-year-olds went to college. Now 70, 75% of the kids are going to college. And if they go away to college, they're gone, period. God help you. They never come back the same. You send off a kid who just came back from the barber, and he comes back looking like Allen Ginsberg or something of that kind. All over the country, parents are saying, what am I going to do with this kid? They don't know what to do with these kids. But what's happening with these kids when they go off to college, especially when they go off to residential college like Iowa State, so forth, is they're thrown in with all kinds of other people from all kinds of other cultures. And there's a tremendous amount of mixture and of interreligious, interethnic, interracial dating, and a tremendous beginning of interracial marriage, too. So I think what's beginning to happen now is that with this great group of 18-year-olds going to college, we are beginning now to break down the old ethnic barriers in the country. But again, most of those college kids, while they may intermarry with each other, will not live in cities. When they go home, even if they came from a city, they'll 2 to 1, as soon as they get married, they'll move to a suburb and keep going farther out. Now, the future battleground of American politics is in the suburbs, because that's where the population is going to grow. Neither party has any kind of a monopoly on the suburban communities in this country. The Democratic Party is not well organized in the suburbs at all. The Republican Party, which was traditional in these suburbs, is not well organized to deal with these great immigrant groups which have come out there. My guess is that as the education level of our population goes up, and as the number of independent voters increases in the country, that party labels are going to mean a lot less. We're going to have a lot more independents and many, many more people voting, not about parties, but about candidates and issues. And of course, the future in our politics, given the age level, you're going to have to look like John Lindsay or Charles Percy or John F. Kennedy, sound like Percy or Kennedy, that kind of thing. Be moderately liberal, moderately conservative, not too far left, that won't go over well, not too far right, that's hopeless, kind of down the middle of the road for most of the kids, I think, in your generation. You're going to be, I think, a kind of generally non-political, in a sense, non-ideological political group, most of you. You'll be attracted to candidates and parties on the basis of programs and of how well they can do them, not on the basis of ideology or of party affiliation or of ethnic identification or anything of that kind. Now, since neither party has yet made the adjustment, I think, to this kind of thing, the ball game's wide open. It's hard to say where we're going in the future. I think I better quit. I've been running about 45 minutes. I'll stop there.
During the question period, a listener had this comment. You think the Democrats control the blacks. I think the reason the Democrats didn't win in Illinois in 1968 was because the blacks didn't go out and vote.
Oh, that's not true. Actually, the Democrats still carry the black vote tremendously heavily. In '64, I think Goldwater got 2% of the black vote in this country. In '68, Nixon didn't get more than 10% of the black vote. And I think you would be, unless you live in a big city, you could be grossly overestimating the militancy of the black community politically. For example, we just had an election in Chicago, a primary, 2 weeks ago or so, in which two militant, good black candidates, Sammy Rayner and Gus Savage, ran against two Daily Machine candidates. Ralph Metcalf, who's black but who's a Daily Machine man, and Morgan Murphy, who's white. There's no qualification whatsoever. The machine rolled over the two, and both Rayner and Savage are good, capable guys who are, with a lot of appeal. They got smashed about 2.5, 3 to 1 in that primary. In 1967, when Daley ran for his fourth term, Daley got 85% of the black vote in the city. Now, some blacks may have stayed home. So I think a lot of people are grossly overestimating the militancy, political militancy of the great majority of the blacks in the big cities. Now, I can't say that that won't change some in the future, because it may, but it really hasn't manifested itself much at all yet. Dick Gregory, who's a way out civil rights militant, he ran against Daley in '67 as a kind of third-party candidate. He was completely out of sight. Nobody knew he was running. He ran very poorly in the black community. So we're not there yet at all, I think. And my own feeling is that the black vote in the big cities is going to follow pretty much the pattern of the old ethnic vote for some time to come. I don't think it's going to change a great deal for a while yet.
Another questioner asked about the future possibilities of metropolitan government.
I think the chances of that are very slim for the foreseeable future in the big metropolitan urban areas. I'll tell you why. A couple of reasons. One, most of the people who've left the city, the whites this whole thing is tied into race now. Race is the most important factor in urban politics in this country. Nationality is really fairly irrelevant compared to it these days. Most of the whites, the ethnic whites who have left the cities to move to the suburbs, don't want to do anything for blacks in cities. They wanted to get away. And what they're interested in the suburbs is two things: keeping their taxes low and keeping those blacks out from moving into the suburbs. And they don't want to pay any taxes to help any black kid in the city or support city schools generally, most of them. So they'd be violently hostile to any kind of a political relationship to the city in a metropolitan governmental situation. And secondly, even on the other side, in the city, the black politicians who are taking over the cities, and will take over the cities, I think, in time, will not want to subordinate themselves and their political power to a metropolitan-wide political system in which they are again a minority and don't have the kind of power that they can have in the city. So I think for practical political reasons, it's very unlikely we will get much metropolitan government in this country for a long time. There are all kinds of urban planners who don't know anything about politics, who draw up these beautiful schemes on an administrative basis saying, this is crazy, air pollution, water pollution, transportation. We ought to work together with this kind of thing. And on a technical basis, it makes sense. But on a political basis, when you get down to the bare bones of the politics, I think on both sides, you're going to get a tremendous hostility toward putting them together politically. I think the most you can hope for is some form of administrative collaboration about things, maybe about pollution, so forth, but they won't put themselves back together politically, I don't think, for a long time, if ever.
Do you think the state governments are holding back on reforms?
Yes. Again, you see, state governments in this country traditionally are controlled by, on a cultural basis, the old white Anglo-Saxon Protestant stock in the country. Those people generally live in small towns in rural areas of the country, and they have no use for the big cities either, because the big cities are full of blacks and Catholics. and they don't want to do anything about those areas at all. And secondly, for practical political reasons. If they really begin to move in that direction, then the rural small-town areas of the big states in this country will get less of the pie themselves. Will pay higher taxes for that kind of thing. Will not be able to milk the big city areas as they have for the past 50, 60 years or so in this country. So I think it's absolutely true. The Supreme Court's one-man, one-vote rule, however, might have some impact on state governments in this country. But I think reform of state government in the United States, I won't say it's hopeless, but it's damn close to it. Most of the big cities now in this country are bypassing the states and going to Washington, where they can get some help for their problems. And most state governments in this country are steadily beginning to lose any real influence, any real governmental influence now in this country. I won't say state government's obsolete, but it certainly is a declining factor in the American political system. Now, the growth of the suburbs may have some impact on the exploitation of the urban area by the rural small-town areas of the country too, because for practical reasons, a lot of suburban communities have common problems with the big cities that they really need to work together with, and you may get, for example, some alliance and relationship between suburban and city areas directed at the rural small-town areas of the states, and a great deal more influence in state government on that basis. Although, again, we're not there yet either, I think. Yes.
Yet another question dealt with Nixon and integration.
I think that Nixon is a man, a very capable technical politician with his ear to the ground all the time. And I think has sensed the dominant sentiment in the country about this kind of thing, that most people in suburbs don't want their kids bused to city schools and don't want kids from city schools bused to their suburban communities. And I think that's generally even true these days of the blacks. The big push in the black community is not for integration these days. It's for black power, black control, and for really segregation on their side of the fence too. So I think the whole issue of integration in the United States, of integrating blacks and whites in the United States, is pretty dead for a few years to come. Nobody really wants it. Most of the whites don't want it, and most of the blacks don't want it. I agree with the Kerner Commission report. That's very bad and very dangerous for the United States to get separated like this into these two communities, each going in their own direction. I would hope myself that your generation is going to move this country back in the other direction significantly as you come to power. My generation is pretty hopeless on this kind of thing. Adults are generally uneducable. You can't change them and change their minds. But I think it's going to be a few years sometime. And I think the black community is going to have to go through the whole black power bit first and establish that, develop the pride that goes with it, and so forth. Then, when they feel they've really begun to develop some equality, they might be ready for integration on a different basis. So I think, and Nixon's got his ear, I think, to that kind of thing quite well.
Finally, a listener asked a twofold question. What political potential do you anticipate for Harold Hughes, and do you have any comments on politics in California?
I think Harold Hughes has some, in fact, we were just talking, driving over here from Des Moines, about Harold Hughes. I think Harold Hughes is probably one of the 8 or 10 potential leaders of the Democratic Party nationally in this country. Partly, and again, he's a capable man who's come a long way in a very short period of time, but I think primarily Hughes has begun to achieve some national prominence already because of the dearth of leadership in the Democratic Party. There's nobody around. So anybody who's pretty good looks real good now in the Democratic, and Hughes is pretty good. He's not great, but he's pretty good. Like Muskie's pretty good and looks great by comparison to most of the characters around now in the Democratic Party. So I think Hughes has some potential nationally. He's got a couple of things in the way. You know, of course, if you come from Iowa or Nebraska or South Dakota, where What's the McGovern comes from, you know, you've got 3 strikes on you in the Democratic Party. Getting anywhere nationally, it's very tough to advance yourself that way. The California thing I'm fairly familiar with. I spent the last 2 summers teaching in Los Angeles at Cal State out there, and I think I know something about California. I think the conservative tide in California is very deep and probably permanent. I think Reagan is no political accident. Reagan is the beginning, and so is Murphy, of a new kind of California politics, which is extremely conservative. And you see, California used to be a very progressive state, but the great migration of population to California in the last 15 years has changed that. The great migration of population to California is from places like Iowa, from the rural Midwest, and from the Southwest, and a lot from the South, and a fairly small migration from places like New York and Chicago out there. The most rapidly growing areas of California, of course, is in Southern California, in San Bernardino County and Orange County, and that's rock-ribbed conservative. And that conservative trend is being reinforced out there, of course, by the great growth of the black population, which is scaring the daylights out of the whites out there. And the last mayoral election in Los Angeles showed that. The black population in Los Angeles has gone up since 1940. 1940 it was about 75,000, and it's up around 1 million in Los Angeles County now these days. So I think myself that in that California culture, and there's a culture out there. There's a way of life out there, which is different. That all these small homeowners with their little piece of land and with the fairly mediocre job are moving in a very conservative direction and are going to be there for the foreseeable future. So I think California is going to be one of the really most conservative states in the country for a long, long time to come. And I think Reagan, for example, next year is going to murder Unruh in the gubernatorial race. Poor Unruh, he's been waiting for 10 years to run for governor, and he's got to run next year, and he's going to get killed in that race because Reagan is really riding high out there.
You have been listening to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today, Milton Rakoby, Urban Affairs Specialist and Professor of Political Science at the University of Illinois Chicago campus, spoke on politics and urban problems. Next week, Robert M. Hutchins, former President and Chancellor at the University of Chicago, lectures on the conflict in education. University Lectures, a presentation of Iowa State University Radio.